right, good morning. Good to see everyone today. We are going to continue our study of Paul in chains and how that is presented in Scripture, not only by Luke here in the book of Acts, but also by Paul, as he is and when he is in chains and dealing with the arrest, dealing with the awaiting of trial, all of these things in his life. What does he say, and what is his message to the church? What did the Christians then need to hear while Paul was in chains, and what do we need to hear? We take the title of this lesson, of course, from Romans chapter 6, where Paul was telling us, you're going to be a servant, you're going to be a slave, but you will be a slave to whomever you present yourself. And you will either present yourself to sin, or you will present yourself to righteousness. And so he tells us, therefore, to present ourselves. And we looked at that idea of presenting yourself, making yourself available as an instrument is literally what that means. And so on down in the book of Romans in chapter 12, we then run into one of the more familiar verses from that letter, and that is that you are to present yourselves as a living sacrifice. And so this idea of willing bondage comes out of the book of Romans, and it comes out of the writings of the Apostle Paul. And so we're going to examine that idea of that willingness there, and in a sense, use Paul as a parable. He is in physical chains, and so he is now an instrument of the Lord. He has presented himself to the Lord for whatever purpose God has for him. You see him willingly go down to Jerusalem, even though a prophet has come to him and said, when you get down to Jerusalem, they're going to arrest you. You're going to be put in chains. And he's going, I'm ready to die. I'm ready to do whatever. But it's also a figurative sense, because Paul is in willing bondage to Jesus Christ. And that's where we need to understand what it is that we have entered into. When we've entered into the covenant with Christ Jesus, what does that mean? What does it entail? And what exactly have we gotten ourselves into? So we're going to do that. So we're now going to go back to the book of Acts and look in some more detail at some of the materials from the overview that we did. And Paul has now been arrested. He's been arrested at the temple there in Jerusalem. And there's going to be these charges that are going to be brought against him. But it is a false arrest. He is accused of defiling the temple by taking a Gentile in. And the evidence for that defiling of the temple is that he was seen around town with this Gentile. So there was no true evidence against him. It was a false accusation. They supposed that he had taken him into the temple. And so they bring these very serious charges. If you are a Jew and you have defiled the temple, that's a pretty big thing. Well, the irony of all of this is that in the process of what they were doing, these Jewish leaders were in fact defiling the temple. They are guilty of the very thing that they're accusing Paul of doing. Now, we want to look at the idea today of the providence of God and how God is utilizing all of these circumstances to work everything His way. So we need to keep in mind kind of the time frame here. This is about 11 years before the temple itself is destroyed. Why did God use the Romans to destroy that temple once and for all? Matthew. Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to kind of complete that thought. They rejected the Lord's Messiah. That religion, as Matthew said, was dead when they nailed Jesus to the cross, because that covenant was finished. It was nailed to the cross there. Why? Why had God told them in the giving of the law that He would bring it to an end? What circumstances brought that covenant to an end? Idol worship, absolutely. There was a defiling of the covenant. They had exchanged the one true God for false gods. They had accepted the false gods of their neighbors, and they were defiling their relationship with the one true holy God. So again, they were guilty of all of the things that came to place and came to pass here. So it was now Paul's dual citizenship that saved him, because he could appeal to the Romans that were coming in there to kind of keep the peace going, and they figured out he's a Roman citizen, and it was kind of shocking to them. They thought that he might be an Egyptian revolutionary that was continuing to do stuff, but he was able to tell them and convince them that he's a Roman citizen. So again, the providence of God in selecting this guy who was, on the fast track to greatness in the Hebrew religion, but also was a Roman citizen. So those two things are going to come into play in his chains. He is going to utilize all of this. All right, so let's go back to chapter 22. And this is important when we realize Paul would say things like, I've become all things to all people in hopes that I might save some. So we're going to find that he is going to talk to the Hebrew people that are there. He's going to deal differently when he's talking to a Roman official. He's going to deal differently when he's talking to the Hebrew officials, the Sanhedrin. But now he gets a chance to talk to people. And it's interesting, the story that he relates and how he does all this. So let's look in chapter 21 verse 40, the last one, and then watch it bleed over into chapter 22 here. So he now has the permission of the Roman commander, the man that's in charge of him. So he says, when he, the Roman, had given him permission, Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people with his hand, and when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect. So now he is conversing with them in their native tongue. Interestingly enough, the Roman now doesn't understand what he's talking about. He just knows that he's talking to them. Brethren and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer to you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew dialect, they became even more quiet. He said, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia and brought up in this city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you all are today. Common ground. They would know the name of Gamaliel. He's getting his bona fides out there so that he has not only some camaraderie with them, but he also can make an appeal. In a sense, I know what I'm talking about. I have been educated in this. I'm a Pharisee, educated by the chief Pharisee teacher. Verse 4 is the ultimate credential for Paul, and it certainly would appeal to the Sanhedrin. I persecuted this way. What's this way? Christianity. It's the church. Jesus made a statement about the way. What did Jesus say about the way when he was alive and before his crucifixion? I am the way. This is the body of Christ that we're talking about here. This is truly the saved of the Lord. So now Paul admits, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and putting both men and women into prison. So here's the man who is now bound, admitting that he bound others for the wrong reason. Also, the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. In other words, these guys that are responsible for me being under arrest, they know the truth. What I'm about to tell you can be verified by my adversaries. What benefit is there of having not your allies give you an alibi, but your adversaries? When they vouch for you, what does that do to your testimony? Enhance it? Diminish it? Say that again? It makes it more credible. Absolutely. All right. So again, remember, he's talking to the Hebrew people that are there. Now he's building this credibility. You want to know if what I'm telling you is true? Go ask the Sanhedrin. Go ask the elders of the land. Here. From them also, I received letters to the brethren and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there in Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. But it happened that as I was on my way, approaching Damascus about noontime, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me, and I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And then I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting. Now, who was he persecuting? The way, people. He was going after individual Christians, and now we have Jesus saying, whatever you do to the least of these, you're doing unto me. This is the thing that Jesus had always said was, in fact, the case. So when those who were with me saw the light, to be sure, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Get up and go to Damascus, and there you will be told all the things that has been appointed for you to do. And here's again the providence of God, the things that were appointed. That word means to arrange in an orderly manner. And it's spoken of soldiers who are getting into a formation. If you like military history and you like Roman leaders and all that other stuff, if you've ever seen them with their shields overlapping and interlocking, and the guys on the back row will throw their shields over the top, and they form a shell like a turtle. That is appointed. The soldiers are appointed. They're arranging themselves as they've been trained. Also, if you're getting ready to go on the march, you line up 2 abreast or 4 abreast, and you march. That's what's there. So Paul's life is not really under his control because he's presented himself to God. He is a willing servant. He's a soldier in the employ of a king, just as a Roman soldier served Caesar, appointed for you to do. But since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand of those who were with me and came into Damascus. Certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standard of the law, again another pious Jew, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing near to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very time, I looked up at him, and he said, The God of our fathers has appointed, there's that word again, you to know his will and to go to see the righteous one and to hear an utterance from his mouth. But you will be a witness for him to all men, Jew and Gentiles, of what you have seen and heard. Now, why do you delay? Get up and be baptized. Wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, Make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves understand. In one synagogue after another, I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I was also standing by, approving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. They listened to him up to this statement, and there they raised their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth. He should not be allowed to live. Wow, that's a pretty stark reaction. There's always reactions to every sermon you hear. I've yet to have that one, so let's hope it doesn't start today. But this man doesn't even deserve to breathe air. He needs to be gone. All right, so let's remember back. These are just regular Hebrews. These are the people on the street here. Why, at this moment he's been arrested, falsely accused of defiling the temple, why right now would he present his conversion story to these people? Why would you take this opportunity to a bunch of Hebrews and tell them how you were brought into the way. Matthew? An opportunity to share the gospel. It's no more complicated than that. These are potential converts. Now it's going to be interesting. He's going to speak to the Sanhedrin. He's not going to tell them this. He's going to have a different message for them. And he's going to speak to Felix, and he's going to present a different story even there. But the point that he is making here that we need to just kind of get from this initial conversation is Christianity is the logical and the intended destiny of all devout Jews. If you are committed to God and love Him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you know that there was another prophet that was coming after Moses. And Jesus is that prophet. He's presented that way. He claims that status, that title. This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to Him. And so this is what God had always intended. The way, the church, is what was foretold by Isaiah. It is not the restoration of the earthly kingdom of David and Solomon, even though that's what most Jews thought. It's not the throwing off of the yoke of the Romans, even though that's what most Jews thought. But Paul is saying, look, I was just like you. I was a devout Jew. When I encountered Jesus, I arose and was baptized, making haste, washing away my sins and calling on the name of the Lord. So he was sharing that gospel message with people who were, in a sense, just like him before he encountered Jesus. Away with such a fellow from the earth, he should not be allowed to live. Why would they say this? They're pronouncing a death sentence on him. What's that? He was a threat. He was a threat to them. He was a threat to everything they held dear. Matthew? For the same reason they killed Jesus. They're rejecting the gospel. They're rejecting the Christ, the Messiah. And ultimately, that's the reason that the temple is going to be utterly destroyed. There's not going to be one stone left upon another. And that exists in that condition to this very day. What sits in the location of Herod's temple today? A mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock Mosque sits there. All the conflict that we read about and we hear about that's going on over there, it all centers around that little bitty piece of real estate. And there is not going to be a temple rebuilt, but there's no need for it. Because there's now a once for all sacrifice, and that sacrifice is Jesus Christ. This covenant is dead. This covenant is gone. So now Paul says, Jesus sent me to the Gentiles, and that's the moment that triggered him. Why would that be a trigger to these devout Jews that are listening to him?
Because they thought they were the privileged folks.
They were the privileged folks, but they loved and appreciated their Gentile neighbors. Didn't they? What was their opinion of the Gentiles that lived around them?
They were dogs.
They were dogs. That's exactly right. They were dogs. They considered them lesser human beings. And now Paul is saying, the Lord sent me. Well, that's it. We're done. We don't want to hear anymore. Well, he presented them this truth. He told them the facts of what happened, but he told them the message that he had received. But going to the Gentiles, being a chosen instrument of God to take the gospel to all the world, to all nations, to all people. Even though the Old Testament prophets had said that Isaiah, for instance, a light to the Gentiles. Boy, they just didn't want anything to do with this. They had been so well trained that they were God's chosen people and that was just always the way it was going to be. This kingdom that had been foretold was going to be established and the nations of the world would serve them. That's what they thought. And yet Paul was saying, no, I'm carrying the gospel there. Well, you need to die. You need to die. All right, so Paul goes before the Sanhedrin. And he's talking there. He doesn't relate his conversion story. He doesn't tell them what all is happening there. But verse 23, Paul looking intently at the council. All right, he's not afraid at all. He is standing at a location where Peter and John had stood. He's standing literally in the same spot that Stephen stood. He's standing right where Jesus stood when Jesus was on trial there. So all of these men are there, part of the council. The intimidating factor, they're sitting in 3 rows of 7 men each. They're lawyers and priests and scribes that are there. Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. Well, that's a bold statement. That's a bold statement to start off with, but these men knew him. They knew that to be a true statement. When Paul would say, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Benjaminite. As to the law, I was a Pharisee. I was blameless. These men knew that that was a true statement of Saul of Tarsus, the high priest Ananias commanding those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. This is illegal, by the way. But the high priest is now treating Paul differently. And Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit trying to try me according to the law, in violation of the law orders me to be struck? The bystander said, do you revile God's high priest? The high priest is the one that caused this. He's defending himself, pointing out the minor detail this was illegal, and they attack him again. Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. All right, so he's highly trained. He's showing them that he knows what the law is, but perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, brethren, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I'm on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. Why did Paul take the Pharisee angle and speak of the resurrection of the dead?
To put a wedge between them and have them, have the Pharisees defend him against the Sadducees.
Absolutely. The Sadducees did not believe there was a resurrection. And in fact, if you talk to and you get into a conversation with Jews today, there are a lot that, even though they don't consider themselves Sadducees, they believe that every blessing they receive in this life is all there's going to be. And they do not believe in a resurrection. And so they will do whatever they can and whatever they need to do in order to become fruitful in this life, in order to be successful in this life, because they don't think there's an eternal consequence. Matthew.
Is there sects in the Jewish religion that are Pharisaical and Sadducean?
As far as being strict adherents, absolutely. The Orthodox, the Hasidics, there are very strict sects to this day. And then there are more secular. The Sadducees were very secular. The Pharisees were very pious. And so even though they don't go by those terms, that you find those schools of thought are very prominent.
So the Pharisees thought above the Sadducees that they had a higher ground.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And they vehemently disagreed on this issue of the resurrection. Whether or not Jesus was resurrected isn't the issue, but there is a resurrection of the dead. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead, and boom, he drove that wedge. Why would he take this opportunity to have that conversation with the council? What are they going to do to him? Say, oh, Paul, you're right. You're one of us. We know you're one of us. Let's hear more about this Jesus you're talking about. Is that their reaction? No, these guys are fueled in their hatred. But it says there in verse 7, there was dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Again, the Pharisees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So there incurred a great uproar. And so we find they're arguing among themselves. We find nothing wrong with this man. suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. I mean, he hit them on their raw nerves. And so we find all of this also. But we find in verse 10 and 11, great dissension was developing. The commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them and ordered the troops to go down, take him away from them by force, and bring him into the barracks. Why? Because he's a Roman citizen. Do they care about the Pharisees and Sadducees? Not a bit. But it's because he's a Roman citizen. But on that night, immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage. For as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must also witness at Rome also. Well, there's one thing being a Hebrew guy in Jerusalem, getting a local commander to do your bidding, to take care of you. It's another thing getting all the way to Rome and getting into the halls of power in Rome. God is orchestrating all of this. And because he's now under protection, now he's under arrest, he's being taken by these guys. There's going to be a plot to kill Paul. The guys bound themselves by an oath not to eat until Paul was dead. They were probably some pretty hungry people after a couple of decades of that. But this commander takes things into his own hands. He gets a strong force. He moves Paul up to where the governor lives. And so now we're going to meet a guy named Felix. Who is Marcus Antonius Felix? And so Paul's going to start out, and he's going to say in chapter 24, verse 1, after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. After Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation. All right, so he is claiming, the attorney is claiming, there is a providential action that is going on here. And so we find this going on. You've got a handout that talks about this guy, Marcus Antonius Felix. And so if you've got that and want to look at that, if you don't have it, I think there's copies of it still in the back. Felix is the governor. He was governor of Samaria first and then ultimately all of Judea. But he was a slave. He was a slave in the household of Emperor Claudius's mother. So here's this guy of lowly estate. He's got nothing. He's got no power. He's a slave, but he and his brother Pallas were freed by the Emperor Claudius himself. And his brother Pallas was an interesting guy because he was very Machiavellian. He was a political animal. He was always working and always scheming, always striving, and he accumulated a lot of power in ancient Rome. He was an advisor, he was a companion, and he was a confidant of the emperor, formerly his mom's slave. Now he had risen to the point where he's got the emperor's ear. So this guy has risen, dare we say providentially, to a very high place. He looks at his own life and sees that he was a chosen one in life. And Pallas, the brother of Felix, is the one that persuaded Claudius to marry Agrippina. Agrippina and her adopted son, Nero, now come into the royal household. So it's Felix's brother convinces the emperor to marry this lady who brings Nero into the emperor's family. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? All from this guy Felix that Paul is now going to stand before. So Nero is the grandnephew of Governor Felix. So this guy is somebody. This is who Paul is going to talk to here. So Felix gets, because of his brother, gets a military command. Then he's the procurator or the governor of Samaria and then all of Judea. So because of his brother, he gets this job and comes into it. So he governed extraordinarily corruptly. He was constantly taking bribes, doing what he could, feathering his own nest, as it will, all through this, because he believed that he had impunity because of his connection back to the emperor. And nothing was going to happen to him because of his brother. His brother was going to take care of him. The historians say this about him. Tacitus said he wielded the power of a king with the mind of a slave. What do you think that might mean? What do you think the mind of a slave would be? Would you be happy in your state? Maybe you want to get out of this, or maybe you wanted to attack whoever you had to attack. What's the power of a king? I'm untouchable. I've got all power. So he's conniving, he's trying to get out, trying to escape, trying to get at the people who are exercising control of him, but he believes that he's above it all anyway. That's an interesting dichotomy in his thinking. And so that's who Felix is this man. Suetonius tells us that he married 3 queens or 3 princesses. Now, one of them, we don't know her name, but 2 of them we do, and both of them are named Drusilla. So it gets kind of confusing when we're talking about his wife, Drusilla. The first one that he married was the granddaughter of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So you get a sense here, this guy is connected. He is powerful, but he is going to go down in flames because of what he does and how he acts. So he also married this unnamed princess, but the other Drusilla was the daughter of Herod Agrippa. So he's going to marry into the Jewish power structure. He's going to marry into the line of the Herods here. Drusilla is the sister of Agrippa II, Herod Agrippa II here. Youngest daughter, 20 years old at the time of Paul's trial. She was said to be very beautiful. And so Felix takes his beautiful daughter and he betroths her to Epiphanes. Ever heard that name before, anybody? The son of Antiochus. Anyone ever heard of Antiochus Epiphanes? His grandfather was the one that took a sow and sacrificed it on the Jewish temple and desecrated the temple back in the days of the Seleucids and the aftermath of Alexander the Great. When his kingdom broke up into 4 parts, Antiochus Epiphanes IV is the one that defiled the temple. And now we're back talking about defiling the temple again. So Felix is tied in to the Seleucids who defiled the temple, to the Herods who rule in Judea, and to Nero and Claudius's family. This guy should have it made. But he doesn't because, again, he's got the mind of a slave and wielded the power of a king. So he tries to get this marriage underway here, but because the groom, Epiphanes, refused to embrace Judaism, they found another suitable guy and gave her to another Syrian king there. So Drusilla and her son Agrippa died in the explosion of Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii in AD 79. Bad luck. They were literally vacationing there, staying in their summer place, and that's how they died. That's who this Felix guy is. In AD 60, a couple years after this happened, Emperor Nero takes him and recalls him because of his corruption. Now, I will say this. If Nero attacks you because you're corrupt, you're corrupt. And so Paul is now going to stand before him. But what do the Jews say? You are a great man. You're doing great things. You're helping out our nation because of providence, because all of this is here. Paul is going to talk to him about providence because he hears this Jewish lawyer mention this from the very beginning. So Felix goes from chains to prominence. And Paul's the one that goes from prominence to chains. And they're going to kind of intersect. Their lives are going to intersect here. But Felix had a lot of experience with rebellious Jews. And it was his administration and all of his corruption that led to a renewal of rebellion against the Romans that ultimately ended in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem itself in AD 69 and 70. This was the beginning of the rebellions of the Jews, and about 8 or 10 years of this, and the Romans had had enough, and they come sweeping in there and wipe them out. So Paul is literally face to face with the guy that is going to light the match that ends up in the destruction of the temple, in the fulfilling of the prophecies that Jesus made about not one stone being left upon another. The providence of God was absolutely at work here. There's no denying it in what's being done. Is Paul a willing participant? Is he trying to figure out a way to get out of this? Or is he a willing participant in what God has in mind for him? He wants to do the will of God. He is completely willing in this. He has presented himself to the Lord as a servant of righteousness. Whatever God's going to do with him, that's what God is going to do with him. But what does Paul tell us? This is how you are to be. Now, we may not be dragged before a Roman governor. Hopefully none of us will, since, the Roman Empire is gone. We may not be dragged before the governor of our state or any of the Supreme Court or anything like that in our nation. But there are things that we are called to do in presenting ourselves as living sacrifices. And so that's what Paul's encouragement is going to be from us. But notice the humility here. Paul has been humbled. John.
Something that I picked up on this, all of the stories, whether it was in the temple or Ananias talking to him, and then for Felix, is Paul always takes and uses his background for the common ground to the group he's talking to, and he's showing the relationship that he has with them, and then showing where it leads to Christ for totally different worlds, really. And I think it's pretty much a great lesson for us to do the same thing when we're sharing Christ, is have that common ground, look for the common ground, and use it to get our point across. And maybe it's even our past experiences that is where our common ground lies.
Right. And that's a great point, because Paul is masterful at doing that. And again, that's part of that idea where Paul says, I become all things to all people in order that, and hope that I might save some. And so he does whatever it takes. He presents himself to his audience in whatever it takes. But he wasn't unnecessarily mean or nasty to the Sanhedrin. What he needed, what God needed, was for this turmoil to strike up so that Paul would take one more step closer to Rome. And he needed the Romans to act like God knew they would act. And they did. And they take him into their custody. They keep him in their custody. They shepherd him now to Felix. And so now he is here before Felix. Well, this is the point that God's working here is going to come to fruition, because it is in fact the cruelty of this man, and it is the corruption of this man that's going to, like I said, light the fire that's going to end up in the destruction of the temple itself. And it's all according to what God had in mind. All right, so let's look at what's going on here and what's being said before Felix. He says, continues on in verse 4, but that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us by your kindness a brief hearing, for we found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissension among the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. Now, actually, they beat him. Saying that we arrested him is kind of sugarcoating all of this. He didn't do anything wrong. So this lawyer is doing the lawyer thing. Sorry, no offense to any lawyers, but he's now playing this on behalf of his client. He's stretching it, and he's kind of massaging the truth here. But Lysias, the commander, came along and with much violence took him out of our hands. Who are the violent ones then? The Jews. Why did Lysias take him? because they were beating him. They were going to kill him. So this guy he's lying. And we know that that shouldn't work, but, Felix is corrupt. So they had every reason to believe that lying to him would work. Ordering his accusers to come before you, by examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you'll be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. And when the governor nodded for him to speak, Paul responded. All right, so that sets the table now for Paul to speak to the third group that he's going to speak to in today's lesson and in this narrative here. And now he's talking not only to these Jews that are sitting over here falsely accusing him, but he's sitting before Felix, the man who's put where he is by providence, the man who was a slave that's now become a king or a governor here. Paul says, knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense, since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Neither in the temple nor in the synagogues nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. All right, so he's telling you, nor can they approve the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way. What's the way? The church, absolutely. This is Christianity in the early days. That's what they called it. Paul persecuted the way. But they, the Jews, call it a sect. I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law that is written in the prophets. So he's expressing his faith here, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So faith and hope are here. He's speaking very factually. Everything he says is true. In view of this, I do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience before both God and men. True statement. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and present offerings, which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia, guys that he had encountered in Ephesus, who ought to have been present before you and make the accusation if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell you what misdeeds they found when I stood before the council. Remember, all they did was argue about the resurrection of the dead. Other than for this one statement, which I shouted out while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today. All right, now look at verse 22. John was talking about knowing your audience and what you say depending on where the people are there. Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way. Why would the governor of first Samaria and now all of Samaria and Judea, why would he have an exact knowledge about Christianity?
Because of the wife that he was married to.
Because of his wife? Because of the family that he's married into? Why would a governor need to know the religious makeup of his province? He knows how to rule them. All right, so you've got these uppity, rebellious people throughout their history. They were rebelling against people over them. And now you've got this other group that the Jews consider a sect of the Jews. But Felix now understands them to be something separate. He's got a good grip on things. So he says, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case. Why? I want to talk to the Roman. I want to talk to the Roman who was there and hear what he's got to say. So he gave orders for the centurion to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom, not prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. But some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess. She's the daughter of Herod Agrippa here. So she is a Jewess, sent for Paul, heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Wow. So you've got Felix, the Roman, and you've got Drusilla, and here's Paul, free to live there in the courts of the governor, and he's going to talk to them about faith, and he's going to talk to them about the Messiah, Christ Jesus. But as he was discussing righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened. All right, so you've got all of this going on. You've got all of this legalese and all of that's over there. Lysias is going to come, and we can decide the legal stuff. But now we're talking about religion. Now we're talking about faith. Now we're talking about Felix, the guy that rules like a king with the mind of a slave, who is so corrupt that Nero recalls him home in just a couple of years. Paul's talking about faith. He's talking about faith in the Messiah, the promised one of God, to the Jews and the Gentiles. Perfect for this family. What more could a Roman husband and a Jewish wife want to hear? That the gospel is for everybody. There's no more exclusion here. But righteousness, Felix. Self-control, Felix. And judgment. What did Felix govern in such a way that he thought he had impunity? He'd never be judged. He's got all the right connections. But when Paul talked about judgment, he wasn't talking about Nero. He wasn't talking about his brother Paulus. He was talking about Christ Almighty. He was talking about the judgment seat of Christ, and now he's become frightened. Why is Felix frightened? Why would a governor in the Roman Empire become frightened when little old Paul talks to him about faith in Christ Jesus and judgment? He knows he's wrong. If what Paul is saying is true, what's going to happen to Felix? It's not going to work out too well for him. He is going to be judged, as the handwriting on the wall said in the days of the Babylonian kings. You have been weighed in the balance and you've been found wanting. We're all going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Paul is appearing before the judgment seat of Felix. Felix is willing to listen to the facts here. He's pretty much dismissed the Jewish account. There's nothing guilty about Paul, but there's a lot that's guilty about Felix. But Paul is sharing the truth. As we say, he's speaking truth to power, and Felix is going to become frightened. Notice what it says as it closes this out. At the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given to him by Paul, a bribe. Therefore, he used to send for him quite often and converse with him. But after 2 years passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. He's playing both sides against the middle. He is being a political animal trying to make things work out, and it didn't work out. He still lost his position. He was removed from power there. Festus is now going to come in, and so we're going to see Paul continuing in chains to do the Jews a favor. He's not guilty. Felix knows he's not guilty. We don't even hear what happened when the Roman commander came up there, but he contradicted the Jews, or would have if he was telling the truth. So Paul should have been set free, but yet Paul is still in chains. Is he a willing participant in whatever it is that God has in store for him? Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So too should we be. And this is the parable of Paul that we're talking about. We should see our station in life as Paul was used by God, that we are to present ourselves as an instrument to be used by God and to be used by Christ, whatever that is. If that's to give a cup of cold water, give a cup of cold water. If it is benevolence, then by all means be benevolent. If it is evangelistic, then share the gospel. But we are to be willing servants of righteousness and slaves of righteousness, as Paul has called us to be. Any closing thoughts, comments for today? Now you know everything you need to know about Felix. So you can go forward knowing that and having that in your repertoire. All right, thank you all. Appreciate your comments. Appreciate your being here in class today. Look forward to our time of worship together.